Okay. The study that we're talking about today is the 13th of a series that the European Observatory have published over a number of years, comparing different aspects of homelessness. And obviously some of you will be joining this specifically because of an interest in prison and the criminal justice system and homelessness. But for those who are more broadly interested in comparative understanding of homelessness, all those studies going back over the years are on the European Observatory on Homelessness website, which you can either get to directly or through the Fianza websites. So this process, which the Observatory and Fianza have been doing for a number of years, now fits very much into the EPOC ending European platform on combating homelessness process, which has been started at the European Union level, where mutual learning has been is a crucial part. So this is a really important contribution that the Observatory and Fianza is making to that understanding. And in that process, every country, every state which is committed to working towards end homelessness, one of the first things they will think about, of course, is preventing homelessness, and a recognition that hard as you work to get people out of homelessness, unless you're preventing it as well, you're not going to achieve your goals. And very soon after you've started to look at preventing homelessness, you realize that one of the places that a person is most likely to have slept on the night before they become homeless is in an institution run by the state. And that obviously includes young people who grew up in care, people in psychiatric hospitals, people in medical hospitals, people who are getting asylum status. But crucial in that is the role of prisons and incarceration and the criminal justice system. So this is a hugely important contribution to understanding that area. So the study itself involves 13 countries, and the lead researchers for the observatory on it were Nicholas Pleece from University of York and Maša, Filipovič, Hrast from the University of Ljubljana. So they're delighted to present the findings of the research. So that'll take about half an hour, and then we'll have about half an hour for questions. We'll try and do the questions, I think, through the chat, and I'll put them to the two presenters, and we also have some of the, I think, experts from each of the countries that contributed to the report have joined us as well, and one or more of them might want to make a contribution through that if they just want to let me know. So with that, I hand over to Nicholas to start the presentation, leaving prison and homelessness. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody. So I'm going to be doing the first part of the presentation. And as Mike said, it's the 13th in a series of comparative studies that we've done. This one included Czechia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Lithuania, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, and Slovenia. Additionally, we put in 2 other European countries as well. So we also did some comparisons with Norway and the UK. So the first point really around looking at the interrelationships between homelessness and prison systems is that there are very considerable differences in prison systems across Europe. So things like the length of sentences that are given for specific crimes is something that's very variable. Probably the biggest difference, though, is whether or not somebody goes to prison for a different range of offences. So whether or not you're likely to go to prison for specific offences varies a lot between different EU member states. So some EU member states are much more likely to use community sentences, non-custodial sentences and fines. Others are more likely to use prison for a wider range of offences. And broadly speaking, you can say that more or less tracks with what their welfare systems are like. So the countries with the most extensive welfare systems, with the biggest kind of social protection systems, also are the countries that are more likely to have less use of incarceration. So they are less likely to put people in prison than countries that have EU member states that have relatively smaller social protection and welfare systems. So there's this kind of broad association between how extensive the welfare systems are and how the criminal justice system works. There's still variations within this pattern. So another thing that's important to note around this is that when we say prison in terms of an individual EU member state, that can mean very different things, because there's often not simply one kind of prison. There are different kinds of prison used for different purposes. Most countries have the equivalent of maximum security prisons, and then they have prisons that are less secure for less serious crimes, sometimes models of relatively open prison, and so on. Now, the reason why it's important to highlight differences in criminal justice systems when you're talking about the interrelationships between prison systems and homelessness is because we do have some evidence that another big systemic difference, which is how welfare systems work, seems to have an influence on homelessness. So homelessness doesn't exist in a consistent form in different EU member states. It seems to vary, at least to some degree, according to how extensive particularly their social protection, their welfare systems are, but also things like their public health systems, and also whether or not and to what extent they've got social housing provision. So broadly speaking, we'd expect the nature of the prison system and the criminal justice system to have some influence on what homelessness looks like in each individual member state. And just to summarize that, so this is a graphic from the report, and as you can see, there's very different levels of incarceration across different European countries. So at the lowest end of the scale there, we've got Finland. We've got my colleague Maša's country, Slovenia. We've got the kind of northwest of Europe and the Scandinavian countries. And then at the other end, you've got some of the Eastern European, Central European states, which are much more likely to imprison people. And then we also had Norway and the UK, which were at opposite ends of that spectrum. So Norway is much closer to sort of Finland, and the UK's closer to the sort of East European end. The UK makes heavy use of custodial sentences. Having said all this about what kind of differences there are and how those differences between criminal justice systems might be important, there are nevertheless some kind of broader patterns that are common across EU member states and other European countries. Perhaps the most obvious one of that is that women are much less likely to be incarcerated. You know, a small proportion of the prison population in European and EU member states is female. They're much less likely to commit crimes that end up in imprisonment. The other commonality was that criminal justice systems across Europe were very often reported to have resource issues. Limited resources in terms of what was going into prisons and how much resource prisons had. So their capacity to undertake rehabilitation, undertake education, undertake other work was quite variable. And the other thing was that there was a broad tendency to report issues with resourcing around systems when someone leaves prison. So probation, other monitoring support services were very often described as being under-resourced. Several of the member states that we included in this study reported that their prison systems were overcrowded as well. So again, this broader point, the rehabilitation, education, other services, the kind of liberal social democratic idea of how prison should work, which is that it should not simply be punishment, but should also provide support that means that reoffending, recidivism and so on doesn't happen. Those systems seem to be either very under-resourced or at least quite seriously under-resourced in a lot of EU member states. And again, this point that there was again variation in how much resource was available in the system. So if you have a look at the report, Denmark is, has relatively well resourced prison and probation services, but a lot of the other member states, including places like France, reported that they had a lot less resource available and that their systems were overcrowded. The other thing that's a common feature of the prison systems across EU member states is that there are shared characteristics in terms of who goes to prison. Now, the most obvious one is that most prisoners are men, identify as men. The other one is that prison systems are much more likely to contain people who are poor and destitute and who grew up in poverty than they are to contain people from more affluent backgrounds. They're also much more likely to have multiple and complex support needs than the general population. So around things like mental illness, neurodiversity, social problems like addiction in particular, they're much more likely to be poor and to have some kind of treatment and support need associated with complex needs. They're also more likely to have experienced things like disruption in childhood. They're more likely to have experienced all the kinds of things that we associate with the probability of committing crime and then the probability that you will be imprisoned if you get caught for committing those crimes. So in terms of the interrelationships between homelessness and prison, people who are homeless and people who go into prison, there are these intersections. Those intersections are particularly around people with complex needs who've experienced often several or multiple short-term sentences, and people who have got shared characteristics who are at heightened risk of long-term and repeat homelessness. So people who go into prison more than once on a short-term basis are more likely to have mental health problems, more likely to have addiction issues, more likely to have other support needs. And that population is similar to the population who are more likely to experience long-term and repeat homelessness. So that's been described by other researchers as a mutually reinforcing relationship. Now, we need to be a bit careful with this stuff because it's still the case that most people experiencing homelessness don't go to prison, and most ex-prisoners do not become homeless. So there are these associations, particularly around repeat offenders who are having repeated short-term sentences, their complex needs, and who is more likely to be long-term and repeatedly homelessness. But we can't say there's just very simple cause and effect that going to prison will always make it more likely that you'll become homeless. But there are these intersections, these crossovers to be aware of. So prison experience is one of many variables that we can associate with long-term and repeated homelessness. So it's another one that appears alongside addiction, mental illness, destitution, social exclusion, disruption during childhood, poor physical health. And these different things can all be associated to varying degrees with long-term and repeat homelessness. Now, determining exactly what effect prison may or may not have on your chances of homelessness in general and long-term and repeat homelessness in particular is a bit difficult because we know prison is one of several variables that we know are associated with homelessness. Having said that, there are some fairly obvious things that happen around people experiencing prison that might increase their risk of homelessness. The first and most obvious of those is that they might lose their housing while they're in prison. And that can be a function of whether or not welfare systems, other support is available to keep their housing open, say, available to them. If they go to prison for 3 months, will their housing still be there? That might depend on familial supports. It might depend on how their welfare system works, or they may be in a situation where if they, go to prison for 6 weeks, they will lose their housing during that sentence. And another thing that we can more clearly associate with homelessness is that there does seem to be a pattern that people who have weak or non-existent familial ties, who don't have very good social and emotional support, are less likely to have somewhere to go on release and maybe at heightened risk of going to prison. So again, we need to emphasize that we're not talking about one thing. When we're talking about prison, there is variation between member states as to what prison means. Again, there's this thing of the importance of the likelihood of imprisonment being highly variable, because some European countries are much more likely to use imprisonment than other ones are. And what this research has tried to do is begin the process of exploring how those interrelationships might work around prison and homelessness. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Maša.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone from my side also. So I will be presenting and continue presenting this general picture of what we found about the interlinks between prison and homelessness and the support for people while living in prison to decrease their housing precarity. And while this is a general description, if you are interested in more details per countries, then of course you can find several details about each country in the report. What is one general message that we got from looking at these individual countries is that, of course, among ex-prisoners, housing precarity was often very high. So they were very often more reliant on family members and friends for their accommodation, especially immediately after prison. And therefore, they could be also described in some cases as experiencing hidden homelessness. So the risk of homelessness, it was not always kind of immediate, but there was a high rate of housing precarity among ex-prisoners, which may increase the risk of homelessness over time. So there is a delayed effect potentially that also makes it more difficult to disentangle this link between being in prison and homelessness, which already Nicholas was describing as very tenacious. So this is especially true when we look at this situation and personal factors that are broadly associated with the heightened risk of homelessness, which are also present in the prison population. So then this link is even more difficult to disentangle and to clearly state whether being in prison has exacerbated the housing precarity and has led to homelessness or not, or other factors have been equally or even more important. So to continue with one issue that we have also looked in the report was the criminalization. So the criminalization of homelessness has several dimensions, which of course vary across EU member states. And the most commonplace is the regulation and control of urban space. So this means the legal prohibition of certain kind of street using activities, of behaviors that are associated with certain forms of homelessness. So particularly street sleeping, begging are often in countries prohibited by law. So one could then assume maybe this, if this is prohibited, then this may also induce more often being imprisoned due to these homeless activities. But here there are, of course, also significant variations among countries in how these laws are put into practice. So this can relate either to the scale of the problems. So for example, one person sleeping on the street may be tolerated, while if there are many, this would not be tolerated and would be prosecuted. There are also variations regarding the place. For example, some activities might be more tolerated in specific areas, while not tolerated in others, like city center very touristic areas and so on. And there is also variation in how these laws, for example, are actually implemented in practice. So, for example, there seems to be evidence of inconsistent enforcement of these regulations. In some countries, these are really rigorously enforced, or in some places, these are rigorously enforced, or by some authorities, while not in others. So this criminalization of homelessness and the association between criminality and homelessness are very different issues. So what we found based on looking at these countries that we had is that there is no real evidence to suggest that there is a direct association between high rates of contact with criminal justice system, high cost, high risk people being arrested and imprisoned for being homeless. But there is, like Nicholas already said, kind of a broad association between this low-level repeated criminal activity and recurrent and sustained homelessness. So there is some interlinkages, but there is no evidence of really homelessness as such being criminalized and leading to prison sentences. What is often the case in many countries is that some specific behavior linked to people experiencing homelessness can be usually fined, so not resulting in prison sentences as such. One example is, for example, Hungary. But of course, if the fines accumulate, imprisonment may be the result of not paying these fines. So it may be, again, a function of a delayed effect. So to continue, one of the issues regarding the support for housing and the support in this area for ex-prisoners is that it was widely reported that there exists an inadequate, inconsistent, and under-resourced support for prisoners who were at risk of homelessness. So looking at these case studies, there was really rarely we found countries that had highly integrated and well-resourced systems of reintegration of ex-prisoners. And also what we identified was a significant shortfall between what was supposed to happen when someone was about to leave prison and the actual practice in this prison system, which was reported by several member states. So despite the fact that countries had, of course, in place support systems that were intended to prepare and aid prisoners on release, this was reported as not happening actually on a degree that would really help, especially in the field of housing. And partially this is also linked to what Nicholas already described as understaffing in prison, overcrowding in prisons, and other contextual factors. The systems of reintegration were also reported often as being siloed, so the uncoordination was widespread. So there was generally no single authority or set of dedicated resources that had the full responsibility for ensuring the housing for ex-prisoners. So these processes were often somewhat confused or uncoordinated, and having really integrated structures was more of an exception than the rule. There were specific projects designed for ex-prisoners to prevent homelessness. So specific services were in some cases available, but usually what we found was small-scale, regional, or pilot projects. So accessibility was a significant issue, as access to specialist projects for ex-prisoners was often very, very limited. Next slide will also describe the other issue of the accessibility is not only the limited access due to the small scale of these projects, but what we also found in some cases was that this accessibility was further limited by focusing on specific groups among ex-prisoners to access these specialist services, either, for example, related to age. In Hungary, there were some limits, for example, in the age of ex-prisoners that were allowed to enter such services, or limited to specific additional vulnerabilities like mental health problems. So this in all limits access to these services. And one additional issue linked to the accessibility that we also looked at was the local connection requirement. So the requirements for local connection to access either housing, social protection services, other support services can become a problem and limit accessibility, especially for ex-prisoners that were already, for example, homeless before entering prison. So the systems, if they were organized nationally, if there was no requirement of local connection to access services or welfare benefits, then of course this accessibility was less of an issue. And some countries, for example, especially in the homeless sector, there was less limitation in accessibility, for example, in France, while in some countries, even for homeless shelters, for example, there are limitations and local connection requirements access this. So the political awareness of the importance of this prevention process exists. What we found there is kind of a recognition that the prevention and provision of housing can prevent recidivism and reoffending, and the countries generally seem to be accepting this principle. But what we found is that they often did not implement this in practice. So they did not really deliver stable housing solution on a reliable basis. So there seems this discrepancy between the recognition and the relevance of this issue and the implementation in practice of support projects. Furthermore, of course, as Nicholas already said, these specific issues are always embedded in a wider systemic barriers. So in general drivers of homelessness, like shortages of affordable and social housing supply, that are really can limit, of course, for various vulnerable groups access to housing, and in particular to for ex-prisoners. Nicholas, next slide, please. Also, of course, the welfare state context is really important, what Nicholas already very much emphasized in his presentation. So often we found that welfare state had very limited support for keeping the housing while imprisoned, either while serving long-term sentences or even while serving short-term sentences. So they did not always cover or support in providing these costs. Furthermore, one important systemic barrier is, of course, the identified kind of reluctance to house ex-prisoners. which was found actually among both, or mentioned in the country reports, among both private rented sector as well as social rented sector landlords. And this is even more pronounced if you look at particular crimes, for example, a history of drug dealing or sexual offenses. So these are even more likely to present a barrier to enter specific housing than other crimes. So to conclude, there is no direct link, or there is no clear link, but there is a heightened risk of homelessness for some, of course, people living prison. And there seems to be a mutually reinforcing relationship within these high-cost, high-risk groups, where, for example, we have high rates of short-term imprisonment, addiction, mental illness, socioeconomic exclusion, and, of course, potentially long-term and repeated homelessness. What was identified in majority of the countries was still lack of prevention and poor coordination of services on release. And this is then, of course, further embedded in general social conditions and levels of homelessness, and wider drivers of homelessness in society, as well as housing supply and welfare state development. Maybe to end with some kind of open question or thoughts. So one interesting thing that we found is potentially the underuse, in that sense, of housing first for ex-prisoners. In only one country, we found specific housing first options for ex-prisoners, more of a pilot project, while actually in some countries there seems even to be a limitation or limited access to housing first for ex-prisoners. So maybe one point of discussion why and how this could be better used, so the housing first options in that sense. And to think about the EPOC, so the European platform for combating homelessness that Mike actually opened up with. So how does this research relate to EPOC? We can say that the goal, one of the goals stated, was that no one is discharged from any institution, and among them prison is also listed, without offer of appropriate housing. So despite this recognition, this seems to be quite underdeveloped goal, as there is still evidence that ex-prisoners are at heightened risk of living on the street or in prolonged stays in transitional accommodation. So this is kind of neglected to be a very core objective in countries, and it's linked also to these barriers that we have identified. I will stop here and await your responses and comments and questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Maša and Nicholas, for that. I think it's fascinating, very deep, rich analysis, and also, as if anybody goes looking at those 13 comparative reports, the variations and the complexities of not just the different national systems in each of the different countries, but very often regional variations as well, and subnational variations, and also the interactions between the different elements. So, I mean, at the sort of the highest level, I think what's emerging from this research, and probably be fair to say emerges from most research on homelessness, would be like, look at the wider system. So you're sort of saying, like, if you were sort of responding to this, you say, well, you should be reviewing your prison system. how many people are you locking up and what impact is that happening? You're also saying it also related to the welfare state, which is also important to remember, and the interaction between homelessness and different welfare state provisions. And you're also saying, obviously, if there was more affordable housing, this would be less of a problem. So those are the big systemic things which really sit very strongly in the background, which I think we know need to be addressed and should be addressed. What is there at a more practical level that's emerging? That I think, like, so one of the questions that occurred to me is, if you were the housing or homeless minister in rather than the prisons minister or the social welfare minister, as it were, in the process, what do you think is coming from good practice or bad practice in the review, which might push you in the direction to certain sort of initiatives that you might push? I'm going to ask that question to Maša and Nicholas, but while they're answering that, which will only take them a moment, of course, if people could put in the chat any questions they have or comments they have, or that would be great for further questions. So I don't know who wants to have a try at my "what would you do if you're a Minister of Housing" question.
Well, Maša, shall I go first? I mean, it's what we always talk about with homelessness, which is that things aren't really organised with people at risk of homelessness in mind. They often fall between the structures that are designed to support the bulk of the population. There's always issues with whether or not homeless people can access housing, whether or not they can access healthcare, social services, social care, all the welfare systems, issues around their access to social protection systems more generally. And then with ex-prisoners becoming homeless, those problems become more complicated and more difficult because there are additional barriers, additional issues that come up when somebody is an ex-prisoner. Like, for example, as Maša was talking about, whether or not a social or a private landlord will be prepared to house you if you've got a history of certain kinds of criminal offence. And then the kind of broader point, I suppose, is that things aren't really very joined up. So, for example, this isn't an EU member state, but British prisons very often release people with no real notice, either to the person leaving the prison or to other services. So one of the reforms the UK has tried to introduce is to not release people on Friday night at the point at which services are not available. Think about who else should be contacted. Think about what systems are going to be available to somebody, and whether or not they're in a position where they just leave. In the UK, for example, they leave the prison with a very small amount of money, which is their kind of discharge grant, which isn't really enough to do anything with, but not with any kind of support system in place. I suppose another difference is that things are much more organised, generally speaking, when somebody's committed a serious offence. So if somebody has walked into a bank with a shotgun and has done a very long sentence, there tends to be more monitoring and support in place in a lot of systems than if they've just done 6 weeks or 3 months for a minor drug offence, in which case there might not be anything in place. And there's variation as to how that happens. But yeah, it's not very organised is the kind of main point, I suppose.
Yeah, I have not much to add, just that this integration and coordination is really the key. And there are some countries that are doing it better than others, of course. So we have identified kind of the Danish, the Norwegian example where this is more integrated with more support in mind. But of course, this is also linked to having the funds to do it, the will to do it. So it's enmeshed also with some of the associated prejudice and discrimination against these people. So how to tackle also that, which can be seen also at the organizational levels, where some systems try to avoid the more problematic groups because they have insufficient maybe staffing, funding, and so on, and they try to optimize that. So yeah, maybe also if we have the Norwegian and the Danish example, they could also supplement with some of the more coordinated stories.
Great. Thanks, Maša. So we've got a question here from Roger Middleton, who identifies early identification as the key. He says, I presume that what we're talking about here is the point that I think in Nicholas's part of the presentation, that not everybody who is in prison becomes homeless, although there's a higher risk of becoming homeless. But so early identification, who is it who is most likely to be at risk of homelessness as early identification within the prison system? I'm taking the question to mean, are there any best practice examples noted in the research of early identification of housing accommodation needs, and at what stage, whether it be in the court system, the prison reception, etc., is there any evidence as to which is the most likely to be effective?
Yes, so there's a little bit in the research about the process of leaving prison starting several weeks or several months before somebody does leave prison, and an assessment being done as to whether or not there's going to be a risk present. You know, things like can you identify people who have not got any family support? So they're not going to have somebody somewhere where they can go when they're released, or they'll have a roof over their head the first night out of prison. Are there vulnerabilities that might increase the probability of them becoming homeless? So, you know, if they're being discharged and there are issues around addiction, issues around mental illness and other support and treatment needs, is there the correct support in place? You know, if they've got complex needs, is there social work involvement? That kind of question. And just trying to make sure that there is a package of support available at the point they leave the prison gates, and not wait until they're actually, you know, outside the prison before anything happens. I mean, this is very obvious stuff. I mean, there's some parallels with avoidance of military homelessness, veteran homelessness, where the military, to avoid some of the risks around potential homelessness with vulnerable armed services personnel when they leave the armed services, you have a longer process of reintegration and support, so they're not suddenly leaving an institutional setting without the right kinds of support and information available to them. So yeah, I mean, in-reach work into prisons, stuff that goes into the prison and comes out with you, is more likely to be effective, we think.
Great. Maša?
Yeah, maybe just to add here that it's also important what we term as a safe and stable housing. So what do they live to? Because I think it's often the case that in prison, this is not really recognized, which housing is the stable one and which isn't. So, for example, in Slovenia, if you look at the prison reports, no one has a problem with housing or homelessness. But in many of the statuses that they will live in right after leaving prison, we would actually turn them homeless. So it's kind of this recognition how to provide really the stable housing. So whether the family they go to will provide them in the long run, or what kind of this housing is available for how long, how supported it is, do they have the sufficient funds? So this, I think, it's also kind of the recognition of what is the problem here. So is it enough to just say that someone got the support, and support for what? In many countries, this support is to get housed in a homeless sector. So, and they think that was the support they have given them. So I think also this recognition of what is homelessness and wider understanding is also important.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's helpful. So Clemence Bouchat, who's with Prison Insider, put a message up which people might have a look at, just about a piece of research which they are working on what seems to be an important study on range of perspectives, including interviews and testimonials from ex-prisoners, public administrators, etc., on this interaction in France, in Finland, and in Canada, etc. And they're going to publish that shortly in several languages. So that's really interesting to know. As all research includes the recommendation that there should be more research, that's really good to see. And Rebecca Hamilton is asking about, it came up in the presentation that was referenced to the local connection issue being in some countries a particular barrier to housing after discharge from prison. Is there particular countries where that was most prominent in, and are there examples of how that was good examples of how that was overcome or mitigated against?
Maša, did you want to go first, or?
No, you were working on the whole report on local connections, so just go ahead.
So in some senses, this wasn't as big a deal as we expected it to be. So it wasn't an issue everywhere, and we perhaps thought it might be an issue in most places. I mean, it depends a lot on how welfare, social housing and other systems are structured. So the greater the degree to which things like welfare benefits, access to social care, access to health depends on you being able to demonstrate a connection with an area, and how those rules work, it can be significant. So if you're in a European member state where everything tends to be organized at municipality level, and municipalities, for example, require you to have lived in the area for the last 3 years, and you haven't lived in the area for the last 3 years because you've been in prison, that becomes a real problem. Where things like welfare benefits are organised at municipal or regional level, that can be a difficulty too, because you need to be able to demonstrate some kind of connection to get at these things. Now, some countries, some EU member states, have quite elaborate mechanisms so that if you leave prison in one municipality, the last municipality in which you are resident has to take responsibility for you in terms of what kinds of support needs you have. But if you're in a situation where those mechanisms don't work properly, you could be cut off from various services that you might need. I mean, big differences around how things help, like welfare benefits are organised. So if welfare benefits are just organised nationally, there might not be a problem with your entitlement with accessing those welfare benefits. But if they're organised at regional level or municipal level, there might be problems with accessing. So yeah, I mean, it depends a lot. I mean, you want really, I suppose, where local connection might be an issue, you want ex-prisoners to have entitlement in the area in which they leave prison as a kind of backstop. So if they go to their home municipality and they're still eligible for support, that's fine. But if they don't have a home municipality, that there's some mechanism that the municipality that they leave prison from has some responsibility towards them. So there aren't these kind of artificial barriers to services that they're entitled to once they leave prison.
Thanks. I think one of the problems that arises there is those local responsibilities often actually manifest themselves as municipalities being very good at being clear about who they don't have responsibility for, while the one that you might argue, without it actually always being necessary that somebody has to take responsibility. So people end up in a sort of a situation which is sort of comparable to statelessness, really, in between municipalities, and that's part of the pattern, isn't it? I was going to ask about Quayo Salguero. You've taken over my screen. I don't know what you've done. Just to let you know that your blank screen is now, I think, quite dominant. I was going to ask in the Irish context, there's no more questions coming in at the moment, so I'm just going to ask a question. In the Irish context, about 20 years ago, there was a government report on preventing homelessness, and in relation to prisons, it recommended that the prison service, the Irish prison itself, should start building up a stock of housing in its own right, which would, so that they would have, as it were, the resource to prevent individuals becoming homeless on release. And for the first couple of years afterwards, I think they built up about 60 or so housing units. And then without it ever being evaluated, to my awareness, they suddenly reversed route and sold them all off again, or moved them on to another body. So we don't know how it worked, but you'd imagine that one of the problems would be that where do you move people onto, and how many do you need? And also that prisons might be sometimes good at running prisons and sometimes not so good at, but probably not very good at running housing. But I was wondering if that's the business of prison authorities or probation authorities themselves developing a stock of housing to try and deal with this issue is something which has emerged at all in other cases.
Not something I've heard of. I mean, quite a lot of countries have some kind of provision for ex-offenders who experience homelessness. So there's, there is some presence, like Maša talked about, of specialist services, which can include supported housing that's fixed site, some not necessarily housing first, like Maša was saying, but some mobile support models and things like that. I mean, there's parallels, obvious parallels between the Irish prison system and the British one, where probation hostels were the response around potential homelessness in the UK, where you would leave prison and you'd go to a probation hostel. I mean, one of the big difficulties was that because the probation hostels were run by the prison service, they were really quite like prison. So there were these issues about what the quality of life was. People were subject to controls and would do things like run away because of what the environment was like and so on. So I think it's difficult. I mean, I think there's a problem with people with more complex needs, as we know, which is part of the rationale for Housing First. People with complex needs, like some ex-prisoners, becoming stuck in systems, and any system that kind of temporarily segregates a specific group and then has to move them into mainstream housing can be a bit problematic around that, because there's this issue of, if you're going from prison into specialist services for ex-offenders, are you really being placed in a position where you're ready to live independently, compared to, say, something like Housing First, where you're put into an ordinary house or some kind of apartment or something, and you get mobile support. So yeah, there are questions around effectiveness, I suppose, which might be what prompted selling it off and shutting it down.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose that leads us into I think we're coming to the end of it now. I haven't got any other direct questions, but both of you talked a bit about, and you mentioned there, Nicholas, Housing First. At the risk of making Housing First the solution to everything, there is quite clearly, particularly for a group of the people that you identify, I think, in all the systems, who are on this cycle into prison and out of prison, who are presumably having mental health issues, addiction issues, and so on, very much Housing First cohort. What sort of progress were you seeing across Europe in terms of use for Housing First linked to the prison system, and what's the barriers were there? I think you mentioned some resistance or barriers in some cases. Do you want to go, Maša or Nicholas?
We haven't really seen. I think that what you said, it's definitely not a solution for everything, but definitely would be a good solution of supported for specific groups. And what I would say it would be important is not to put a barrier toward entering housing first for ex-prisoners. I think that is the problem that is evident, but in general, why there is not more for these groups, I think it's that they are maybe invisible in this complex people with multiple problems, and therefore maybe not really evident that actually housing first caters also to some of these people.
I mean, just to echo that, there's not very much research. We did look at a Housing First project which was designed for women ex-prisoners in Manchester. Two very quick things from that. The first thing was how complicated the line between offender and victim is around crime, and the intersections between vulnerability and crime. That people who commit crimes are very often the victims of crimes themselves, and particularly around, this project was for women, as I said, around their experience of domestic abuse and violence. The other thing that it found, which might be particular to that setting and the people that it was working with, was that reoffending dropped to nothing, even amongst a group who'd been included some very high frequency offenders, so people who'd been in and out of prison, who just kept getting caught and kept being imprisoned on for multiple times, and being in stable, adequate housing with support in place greatly reduced it. I mean, offending almost stopped amongst a population that had been characterized by multiple offences, which is part of the logic for setting it up.
Right, I think that's a very good, very important finding, because if there's surely one thing that the criminal justice system will be concerned about is the level of reoffending and the ongoing costs. So we got one very final question came in, and we'll finish at that. And it's a question from Aisling Dunn, who asked, did the research find any links with prisoners being discharged from open centres as having better outcomes in relation to homelessness? I don't know exactly what is meant by open centre, but you might be familiar with the term.
Well, if we interpret that as kind of an open prison, short answer, no. More complicated, but equally, try and keep it very short. There might be something about who goes into those prisons. So open prisons, open things are more likely to be white collar crime, more likely to be middle class people committing white collar crime, not serious offences, things like that. So they might be a population who's inherently a bit less likely to be in a situation where they've got no resources on leaving prison. So we didn't find anything. That's a possible reason why there might not be a pattern, or we need to be careful about assuming there's a particular pattern. But we weren't able to cover all the diversity of the criminal justice system because this was quite broad level research. So it would be interesting, it always to add to Mike's frustrations. Yeah, we could recommend more research on top of this research to look at whether or not specific models of prison are more or less associated with homelessness.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that brings us neatly to the end of the hour. I know people will be wanting to start leaving. So I just want to thank Nicholas and Maša for the presentations, which I think were excellent, and lots of comments from people saying saying how good the presentations were and so on. Remind people that the full report is available on the Observatory website. I think Brett put the link up to that right at the beginning. And Rocio did for the specific report. But also, if you are interested in this wider comparative issue, to have a look at the earlier ones going back over, I think, 13 years. Some of them obviously more historical than others at this point, and to say that one of the things the observatory is working on currently is to try and bring together the huge range of different research, comparative research, and other research reports that have been done over the years into some form of book to try and bring this together in an accessible form. So that won't be in the immediate future, but I think it'll be something that will be very helpful to everybody who's interested in research in itself, and also the impact of research on policy and generally contributing to moving towards ending homelessness. So thanks to Nicholas and Maša again. Thanks to Rocío from Fianza, and thanks to all of you for attending the event. Brilliant. Goodbye.
Thank you, Mike, for sharing.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Maša.
Hi, thank you.
Well done. Great. Well done.